This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On Trafalgar Day of 2016, the RCMI and the Naval Association of Canada had the honour of hearing Canadian naval historian Capt Steven Dieter address us on Canada's wartime light aircraft carriers HMCS Puncher and HMCS Nabob.
Well, David, thank you very much for that warm welcome. It is truly an honor to be asked to be here today on what is a significant date in the naval calendar. And so when I was asked to be here, my initial thought was, and I was asked several months ago, just to give you an idea, what does an Army officer with a background as an Air Force historian say to a group of naval-minded individuals who have a wealth of experience in the Royal Canadian Navy, which won't make me sound stupid? So let's start with a short snippet on Lord Nelson and Trafalgar. I know there's a fair number of dignitaries here today, and I'm humbled to be here in front of you, but I'm going to draw attention to a good dear friend of mine, David Douglas, who's the Canadian commander of the Equestrian Secular and Chapterial Order of St. Joachim, which was one of the orders that Lord Nelson was wearing at his at the Battle of Trafalgar. And if you go to the Museum at Portsmouth, you will see the breast star fourth here on the on his jacket. So I want to make acknowledgement to David and to our order as a connection that I have indirectly to Nelson. But now that I've said that, it still puts me back onto, so what do I talk about? And as I pondered over the thought during the summer, I was actually asked by the Naval Historical Foundation down at the Washington Navy Yard to review an episode of a series the Smithsonian Channel was doing. The series is called Hell Below, an events-based series charting the stealth game of subsea warfare, tracking the dramatic narrative from contact to attack of the greatest submarine patrols of the Second World War. Interestingly to note, it was made by a company out in Vancouver. It covers themes from the rise of the wolf pack to the drive for victory in the Pacific, profiling the strategic masterminds, and the rapid evolution of technology and tactics as the threat of undersea warfare begins every sailor's worst nightmare to life. Now, of the 6 episodes of the series, I asked to review episode 4, entitled Atlantic Showdown. Now, the episode summary from the Smithsonian's website dramatically describes the scene for the viewer. March 1943. 2 Allied convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, leave North America, bound for Britain. They total nearly 100 ships, carrying vital food and raw material to supply the Allied war effort. John Gordon Luther commands the short-handed escort group charged with protecting convoy HX-229. Short at least 2 ships, he lacks adequate defenses for the mid-Atlantic U-boat attack that Karl Donitz, Gross Admiral of the German Navy, has in store for them. For 3 days, the convoys are hammered by a merciless litany of torpedo attacks and an Atlantic winter storm. Many ships are hit, and Luther is repeatedly torn between protecting the convoy or falling back to rescue survivors of torpedoed ships. It's the largest convoy battle of the Second World War, and one that nearly cost the Allies the Battle of the Atlantic. So Allied Showdown suggests a great scene of conflict, and yes, what is presented is an effort on the seas. But in my mind, watching the episode, it was only a partial presentation of the full Allied effort. Now today, yes, I'm going to talk about Nabob and Puncher, 2 episodes, or two vessels that have an interest in me and have for over 20 years. But there's some other areas that I'm going to touch on, such as the impact of carrier escort vessels, the future of naval aviation coming out of the Second World War, naval air operations, and an area that has become of interest to me in time, which is the Caribbean region, because that all ties into the strategic element of what we see going on in the Atlantic as we go from a control from British to American to Canadian influence over the convoys. Now, we know the Pacific was a vast theater of operation for naval activity, but I think the Atlantic, because of what we're dealing with, the Arctic, South America, the Caribbean, and the material that's coming through is one of the most significant theaters of operation, rather. If you think about what's coming out of the Caribbean and Latin America in terms of raw goods, the bauxite from Jamaica, the oil from Venezuela, finished products from the U.S. and Canada, the raw manpower. We had to get the stuff overseas. The convoy was perhaps the easiest way to do it. And as we know, there were fast convoys, slow convoys. They were under the escort of the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy. And, you say, okay, sounds easy enough if you don't understand the restrictions of war at the time, the number of ships. And as I say here, sounds easy enough, especially since aircraft should be able to provide supporting cover. Yes, there was a phenomenon called the air gap, which covered a great span of the ocean over which coastal patrol aircraft from either side of the Atlantic could not cover. And welcome to the challenges of 1942 and 1943. So back in the Atlantic Showdown, it talks about the 100 merchant ships with just 5 escort vessels covering the Atlantic Ocean, where they are hit by not 1, not 2, but 3 different U-boat wolf packs totaling close to 40 subs. Now this episode of the series very nicely explores the challenges of the Allied forces, where we address the limited number of support vessels to the convoys and the challenges of weather and space. And equally, the German forces lacking both distant and deep sea water ports, being unable to replenish their vessels, so they're out for weeks, months at a time. Prolonged time at sea, limited time of maximum capacity. As I note here, once they were out of torpedoes, the offensive capability was limited to being an observation post, which became an integral element for the sharing of information. But when you're out to fight a battle and you become a secondary duty, you kind of feel that of the battle. Now, what I like most about the episode, this is where I'll name drop. I'm a sucker for seeing the talking heads. Now, in this particular episode, Mark Milner was the talking head from Canada, and I've mea culpa right here. I've known Mark for close to 20 years. Without a doubt, one of the finest naval historians in this country. So to hear him speak and to see the British and the German speakers, and most notably a frigate captain by the name of Christian Jentz from the Germans, who I've had a chance to liaise with, gave the episode context. And I know that's sometimes hard when you wear the uniform to realize that there is another side to what happens. But to see this episode, you get the sense of what the U-boats were going through, what the Navy was going through, and that everybody has something to talk about in terms of success and lessons learned. Now, as a student of history of the 1990s, I have to admit I was very lucky, very fortunate to be at a university with both a strong military history program and a strong naval history program. And no, that was not the Royal Military College of Canada. That was Wilfrid Laurier University just up the road here in Waterloo. One of the key lessons I remember, which is glossed over in this particular episode of the series, is that during the Second World War, the Navy grew from an undistinguishable small fleet to one of the largest military elements in the world. Our role in the convoys in the Atlantic theater, both in terms of the merchant navy, which for many years had been, at least within a Canadian context, a forgotten component of the convoys, and the RCN itself is worth recognition. It should also be remembered that as the war progressed, Canada was the only Allied naval force with assets in the Atlantic able to respond to an effort to support the convoys, the result of British and American assets being drawn from the Atlantic to support efforts elsewhere. This tenuous situation became compounded in late 42 when the British requested that convoys shorten their travel times to bring more material to the UK, which was facing a continual shortage of goods. And sadly, one of those history lessons that's an afterthought is a gentleman by the name of Rear Admiral Leonard Murray, the only Canadian to command a theater of operation. As Commander-in-Chief Canada Northwest Atlantic beginning in April 43, at a point where the Royal Canadian Navy assumed, and this comes right out of the official history, the acknowledged role as guardian of the convoys. Writing on the Battle of the Atlantic and the air gap for that review brought me back to my time as an undergraduate, where I was fortunate enough to study under, amongst others, Barry Goff. I do not think it would be out of turn for me to say that Professor Goff took me under his wing and took a liking to me, but my time in his sea power courses certainly cemented me in his good books, without a question. But it also served as the root of my naval studies and interest. My second naval history course with him, Barry and I sat down and I said, I want to do the Naval Air Service. I'm an Air Force historian. I had just come from my time at the Billy Bishop Museum in Owen Sound. I really had this drive for military history and aviation history. And Barry said, you know what? 1994, not a lot of source material handy. How about we steer you this way towards the carrier escorts? And as a result, he wrote a letter. I went to Ottawa. I went before the director of the Directorate of Heritage and History, a gentleman many of you in this room know by the name of Alec Douglas. And when I walked into the office and handed him the letter from Professor Goff and the letter from the president of the Billy Bishop Heritage, he immediately grabbed me by effectively the scruff of the neck, took me out to one of his historians and said, you will look after this gentleman for the next 2 days and give him anything he wants. I thought, well, geez, I must be doing something right. So, Puncher and Nabob. In terms of vessels, as was indicated, yeah, they were American. They were part of the boat class. They had been successors of an earlier version that had been produced on the West Coast. The Brits had ordered more vessels after the initial 11 had come out, so there was another 15. Nabob and Puncher were 2 of them. They were a slightly bigger, broader, faster vessel than what had come out before. I think their top speed was 18 knots. The carrier deck was 112 feet. And so, you know, how did these vessels end up as part of the Canadian Navy, and why did we need them? Did we need them? Was it a case of we just simply said, this is a cool toy to have? No, of course not. As we all know, the Navy had evolved. The gunboat diplomacy of the 1930s had bubbled over into a new world where it seemed that every possible vessel was being brought into service. Every vessel, either by construction or acquisition, was being used to defend Canada, Newfoundland, the Atlantic, the Pacific. At the time, some politicians and perhaps some pundits as well wondered if Canadian assets were just simply an extension of the British, being easier to deploy in a world where the number of capital ships were being capped because of the various naval conferences. As we remember, through the period between the wars, there were the naval conferences which capped the number of capital ships that each navy of the 5 major nations could have. Canadians ended up responding to distress calls in 1932 from British civilians down in El Salvador that were caught up in the political turmoil following the presidential election. The HMCS Saguenay was doing work down through Jamaica, using an RN basis and participating in exercises. The exercise of ships down in that region is not uncommon. Mackenzie King had wanted to expand the economic connection to the region. And as I say, we took advantage of the facilities that were down there, Port Royal being a beautiful one in Jamaica. But we still had that issue to deal with looking after the ships in the Atlantic. And the protection of the convoys was British. It was British responsibility. And what was happening, of course, in Britain, as we all know, or perhaps as we may not fully realize, was that they just simply couldn't meet their demands. We see it in the fall of Singapore. We see it where the Canadians are being asked to assume garrison duty in the West Indies. We see it where the Canadians are being asked to assume garrison duty in Iceland to help with the flying of the ships and the moving of the material across the Atlantic. And so in the end, we've got, like I say, this huge Atlantic battleground. And the Americans wanted their level of control, there's no question about it. But the Americans were more interested in what was happening in the Pacific, but they also wanted the Caribbean. They wanted the resources. And interestingly, what I didn't realize until I was reviewing some sources, was that the Americans had proclaimed what we're going to call, or what they called, a Pan-American neutrality zone. Extended from Halifax down to Brazil. Huge area. The challenge of declaring such a zone was enforcing its neutral nature. And of course, America was not involved in the war at this time, because we're still talking 1940, 1941. Would not engage vessels unless its own fleet were at risk. And Britain, lacked the vessels to patrol the area. In the end, of course, what ends up happening is we see the Lend-lease agreement come in, the exchange of vessels, vessels for locations. Britain is eager for the vessels, ceding in the end airspace and territorial waters and jurisdictions over nationals to areas on 8 British territories. These included territories where Canada had already deployed troops for garrison duty, which included Jamaica, Bermuda, the Bahamas, and Newfoundland. Mackenzie King was all in favor of the Americans occupying more locations at a time when they could be neutral, or when they were neutral, rather. And in 1940, Mackenzie King advised Churchill that the U.S. should be afforded opportunity to get bases basically all over the map. Canada, according to Mackenzie King, could not protect the coasts adequately, and he implied that the Royal Navy, stretched as it was, could not honor all its worldwide obligations. Now, in his response, Winston Churchill noted a willingness to discuss options, but had to consider a possibility that abandonment of these posts by the United States could leave them further crippled. Remember, we're still talking June of 1940. And as we see by the time we go through Pearl Harbor and into 42, the Americans aren't in a position to man convoys. So an Atlantic Convoy Congress in March of 43 between the Navy, the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, and the Royal Canadian Navy convened in Washington, and basically the end result was that it had become appropriate for Great Britain and Canada to take complete charge of the North Atlantic convoy system. Now, as I noted earlier, Rear Admiral Murray was appointed Commander-in-Chief Northwest Atlantic within a month of this conference, and what we see is the rise of the Canadian interest in being a greater naval power. At the Quadrant meetings in Quebec in August of 1943, the Navy says, "We're getting the vessels, we haven't got the manpower. Can you help us?" This wove into the Canadian Navy's desire to expand. The Navy at that point had been discussing a naval air branch. The wartime bonus of being the creation of support for anti-submarine forces. And there were people that saw post-war development on this, and one of them was a captain by the name of Horatio Nelson Lay. Now, fine man in his own right. One of those key things you've got to throw out there for objectivity is that he had a very famous uncle by the name of William Lyon Mackenzie King. who just happened to be this guy called Prime Minister of Canada. Now, Lay had been a cadet of the Royal Naval College of Canada, served on board several ships, including the first commanding officer of Gaspé in 33, the commanding officer of the Restigouche in 40, the only Canadian commanding officer of HMS Nabob, and then a series of staff positions, eventually retiring on Trafalgar Day 1958 at the rank of Rear Admiral and as chairman of the Naval Staff. Lay would argue that the Navy needed to add a carrier to the fleet. To do so furthers the efforts of Naval Staff Headquarters for larger fleet units, and even the Admiralty had been made aware of Lay's intent, noting that then Captain Lay intends to recommend such a development of fleet air arm as no modern Navy, however small, can operate without an air element. I'll come back to that point as I wrap this up. So finally in 1943, December of 1943, Ian MacDonald, the Minister of National Defense, puts forth the plan to obtain 2 escort carriers on loan from the U.S. Initial resistance from the Prime Minister over the vessels soon dissipated when he learned that his nephew would command one of the vessels. However, Canada could not receive the carrier escorts directly from the Americans due to the condition of the Lend-lease agreement. They would first have to be christened as Royal Navy assets before being turned over to the Canadians for manning. Now, it's worth noting that for Captain Lay and the crew of Nabob, there were great growing pains. As part of the crew was paid at Canadian rates, part of the crew were paid at British rates, which were noticeably smaller. Lay's ability to resolve this issue made it easier as we move into the second phase with HMS Puncher for Captain Roger Bidwell, who took over as became commanding officer of HMS Puncher and didn't have to deal with those issues because Lay had addressed them very handily. While some might argue that neither carrier vessel escort had what could be called a stellar history, each had an episode of significance which I feel allots them more place in the collective history than just a placeholder on a list of vessels. For HMS Nabob, the issue of pay equality should be significant enough for historical record. However, there's a bit of our operational history that I think needs to be brought to folks' attention. While operating with the Home Fleet, she participated in Operation Offspring, the largest mine-laying sortie of the war, and was part of the initial attacks on the German battleship Tirpitz, anchored in Norway. It was during that engagement that Nabob was crippled by a torpedo and managed to limp back to Scapa Flow, with 11 Canadian and 10 British ratings having been killed or reported missing. HMS Puncher, by the time she came into service, had spent the second half of the war as part of the convoy run, moving airplanes and troops across the Atlantic, and would then later be part of the airstrikes along the Norwegian coast. When war ended, she served as a troop ship, bringing service personnel back to Canada. So was the experiment successful? Did Canada needing floating airfields and a naval air element? Did our experiment manning the British ships mean anything? Now, as an Army guy, and with a penchant for Air Force history, who has a wife who wore a naval uniform for a period of time, I think it was successful, demonstrating the ability of us to operate in the North Atlantic, an area which would once again be explored in the post-war Cold War period. Whether the experiment was successful, keep in mind that the two captains of Nabob and Puncher, Lay and Bidwell, went on to have influential careers. They became part of the force of boosting the development of the helicopter-carrying destroyer, the backbone of the Royal Canadian Navy, as some would argue. The experience with Nabob and Puncher resonated within the Navy itself. Before the end of the war, negotiations were underway for 2 additional aircraft carriers from the Royal Navy to join the fleet. They were just joining the fleet. We had the option to buy them later if we really liked them. So Something perhaps you should have exercised with some submarines. Very early in 1946, HMCS Warrior joined the RCN, although it was quickly discovered that operations in Arctic conditions were not possible. However, she served proudly until the Magnificent joined the fleet, serving until 1957, when HMCS Bonaventure became the third, or the fifth if you count the carrier vessel escorts, became the third carrier of the Royal Canadian Navy. Now, our carrier history officially ends in 1970, although naval aviation continues today with Sea King helicopters flying from our frigates around the world, including HMCS Charlottetown, currently deployed on Operation Reassurance, conducting operations in the Black Sea and on Exercise Joint Warrior on the coast of Scotland. The men and women of our Canadian Armed Forces, and in particular our Royal Canadian Navy, serve with the same dedication, sense of pride, and professionalism which our predecessors displayed in war and in peacetime. In closing, on behalf of my wife Beth and I want to thank the Toronto branch for the invitation and the opportunity. I hope I have not done the senior service any disservice with my presentation today. While I look forward to chatting with you later after we wrap things up, if there are any questions, I will say that the National President of the Naval Association of Canada has sitting on his desk my membership card to the Naval Association of Canada, so you've had a convert. And that I'm very happy to have been here today. Thank you very much.
This has been another in the ongoing series of podcasts brought to you as an educational service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. You can keep abreast of our web offerings as well as our live events by visiting our website at www.rcmi.org. Once again, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for being with us and good night.